I think we've seen this swing in the industry where people are taking things a little bit too literal on the theoretical side of things, where they see an exercise and they point out everything that's wrong with it, everything that doesn't align with the specific goals of that athlete or that person. Say if it's hypertrophy training, they'll knock a pull up, or they won't put a pull up in the program because it's not the most ideal way to align the force of gravity with the muscle fibers of the lat. So it's not an effective hypertrophy movement for the lat. And theoretically, I think you can draw that conclusion. You can do that, and you can do it logically. But in application, it's not actually the truth, because you and I have seen it time and time again. There's people who pursue hypertrophy training and they do it with this sort of rationale. But over time, if there's not an underlying vein of function in the program that they're running, there's going to be a diminished output over time, because they're starting to lose, say, range of motion. They're limited to a specific range of motion in which they can train through. There's a diminished ability to stabilize the spine, the scapula, and therefore the shoulder joint itself. So there's not going to be the ability to put as much of a meaningful stimulus through those joints, because that underlying stability isn't there. And that's what I would boil this point down to, is that if we want to be able to train something effectively, like a lat crosses the majority of the spine. It crosses the entire lumbar, thoracic, the scapulothoracic, and the glenohumeral joint. If there's any sort of lapse in stability along the way, then we're going to have a diminished capacity to produce force through that specific muscle group. So anything where you're talking about shoulder function, it really has to start with lumbar stability. It has to start with thoracic stability. There has to be a conversation around scapulothoracic stability and glenohumeral joint stability before you can really, we'll say, optimize output through that specific muscle group. And I think that's an overlooked point when it comes to the idea of hypertrophy training or maximizing output in that specific scenario.
Yeah, I just think bottlenecks, right? Like when you take a look at an exercise program, so if you guys are listening to this and you're, whether you write programming for people, you write programming for yourself, try and dig down for every exercise, like every exercise you have on paper, every exercise that you do. Try and figure out what is the guiding principle of this exercise that's putting it in my program. Like, number one, like, what does it do? Like, I think people kind of get, they get sound bites through social media, or they overhear stuff from the gym, whereas sometimes they just do it because they've always done it. And, I think what you learn over time with training is you learn that the bullseye of like meaningful adaptable stimulus is not as small as you thought it was before. I think that's real training wisdom is that what you think has to be this, like, this head of a needle of a target you need to hit is actually more like the broad side of a barn. And the more you start to realize that people who are cast as outliers or genetic freaks aren't that at all. They're just people who are hitting the broad side of a barn. And you're looking for a needle in a haystack as far as like, what you need to accomplish from a threshold standpoint to actually get the stimulus that you need to, elicit an adaptation that we all desire. So when we look at common approaches for training, let's stay obviously sticking with the upper extremity, building up around the shoulder. The driving process of most people's exercise is length tension relationship. So for those of you, whether or not you know that's the case, whether you know what those words mean, let's explain. The length tension relationship is just that, is how much tension can a muscle create at a particular length. So whenever you hear someone reference, we're training this muscle in its lengthened position, we're training this muscle in its shortened position, we're training this muscle in its mid-range position, what the principle that's guiding that language is the principle of length tension. Now, that is one mechanism at play, right? But there's what is born out of that is, this is where, and I hate to use the word, and maybe I'll give it a little bit more context. Most people now, when they speak about optimal hypertrophy training, which is almost, a vomit inducing term, just with how much it's bastardized, what they are referring to is the decisions they're making in exercise selection, setup, stabilization, and execution are optimized for the lens of length tension, right? Now, the thing that I find so paradoxical with people who optimize their exercise selection for length tension, what they are attempting to do is they are attempting to get the most out of every muscle in a particular movement. And like, hey, fair play. That sounds like a fair goalpost to kick towards. Like, why wouldn't you want to get that? Because there's a whole bunch of other things you need to focus on to keep the train on the track so you can continue to do that for a long time. I would say I have like not necessarily a formula, but there's boxes that I prioritize in my training that are much broader, right? So I think I'll have per muscle group, maybe once or twice a week, depending on the size of the muscle group, I will have something that optimizes for length tension, or I will have something that optimizes for an inefficient length tension. And this is where you need to realize, like, look, I like training. I like training for at least an hour. In a perfect world, I would love to get back to the point where I train for 2 hours. If I'm training for 2 hours, I have to understand length tension, but not from the standpoint of, optimizing for length tension in every exercise, because my workouts would be 35 minutes. If I'm taking every muscle I train behind the fucking woodshed and really, putting this stimulus that's waving in accordance with the amount of tension my muscle can produce, they talk about stimulus to fatigue. It's another concept that's worth knowing, and it's another concept that's rooted solely in the length tension relationship. That's really effective stimulus to fatigue, which means, if I do all these exercises that are optimized for length tension, and I train, 1 or 2 muscle groups in a session, and I use a handful of exercises, I don't have that many working sets, right? My repeated ability at that muscle group will be diminished because it'll have undergone so much stimulus, which sounds great. But what if I want to what if I want to build a work capacity, which is like the enter first bottleneck to long-term hypertrophy? Like, if you take someone who optimizes for length tension, but at no point optimizes for work, and then you put them in a scenario where they have to have some sort of like strength endurance, right, in less than optimal settings, in exercises that are optimized for work rather than stimulus, which, or by their language, would be fatigue rather than stimulus, then they gas out, right? And this is where we start running into problems, because most of the lifting that we do outside the gym is grossly inefficient by the terms of length tension, right? And this is where I think bodybuilding has gotten away from the idea of work capacity. And work capacity carries with it so many different facets that are going to be indirectly important to hypertrophy. Like, if you take someone and you take someone who optimizes their training for the length tension relationship, use the lat is a very common one, and you take them and put them on something like a single arm dumbbell row, the coordination, the ability for simultaneous muscular co-contraction, and the output metabolically that demands of someone to integrate those systems, it fucks them. And it's like, okay, like, you actually need the stimulus to fatigue ratio is not something that you need to optimize purely for stimulus and diminish fatigue, because at a certain point you're going to be so bottlenecked to your work capacity that you're not going to be able to get enough stimulus in. So when you look at an exercise program, and there's an infinite number of ways that you can decipher the mechanism of each exercise, but you need to solve for more problems than just the direct stimulus to hypertrophy. You need to, a lot of times, solve for the bottlenecks, whether it be, quote unquote, functional, right? If you can't get into certain positions, Like if you have an inability to co-contract, if you have an inability to stabilize outside of like a presence of a machine, you're going to be diminishing your long-term ability to drive stimulus. So what I suggest, and kind of like a method that I try to impart on people is like, look, let's take a look at your program. Tell me what you're optimizing for, right? Oh, this exercise is optimizing for the lengthened position, and this exercise is optimizing for the mid. Okay, look, it's just one thing. Okay, that's one thing. Well, okay, what is your problem? Like, well, I'm not really strong in these exercises. It's like, okay, let's optimize for strength. What does that look like? If I said optimize for strength, what would you do? Well, if I was optimizing for strength, I would do like deadlifts. I was like, okay, well, why don't you deadlift? It's like, well, deadlifting is not optimal for like tension relationships. It's like, but your issue is that you're not strong enough for any of the cute stuff you're doing. So, but why are you optimizing for that when this to be your bottleneck, right? Or, I know people who get their clients to, and I've seen this a lot lately, actually, where people are getting their clients to do some of these exercises that are optimized for length tension relationship. And I look at them and in between sets, they're like gassed, like some sort of single arm supported row, absolutely fucked. And I'm like, what do you think that person's bottleneck is? Like, why can't they do more on the single arm thing? And it's like, they're just not in really good shape. I'm like, well, why don't you optimize for conditioning? Like, why not? Why aren't they on an assault bike and doing some sort of interval thing, right? Because there's a lot of bottlenecks that stand in the way.